Today we're going to start talking about consequentialism. This is a significant way of rethinking what ethics is all about. The two founders of consequentialism in the modern world are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They knew each other. In fact, both were child prodigies, and Bentham, together with James Mill, an economist, worked together to educate John Stuart Mill, James's son. And so there's a kind of family relationship here and close friendship among them. Bentham was a kind of curious character. He was a prodigy. He was a brilliant guy, entered Oxford at age 12, graduated with a law degree at 19, decided he would never practice law, and so he basically founded a mess. So started a journal, the Westminster Journal, or the Westminster Review, rather, and started a group he called the Philosophical Radicals. His idea was to bring scientific thinking to philosophy and to politics. And so his great work is known as the Principles of Morals and Legislation. He tries to articulate scientific principles for solving problems in morality and in politics. In some ways, he's trying to fulfill Leibniz's dream of having a calculating machine or some kind of logical calculus that would let you address these problems. Leibniz had that thought. He said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some method by which to decide these questions? So instead of arguing, instead of killing one another over basic moral and political questions, we could just say, calculemus, let us calculate, and come up with an answer we could all agree to. Bentham thought exactly, and so his mission is to give us that calculus. Now, in some ways, he's remarkably successful. Businesses, governments, and so on use something like a cost-benefit analysis on a lot of problems. The heart of that is straight out of Bentham. He is the person who originates that whole way of thinking about things. Think about the possible costs. Think about the possible benefits, not just for yourself, but for everybody involved. That's the core of the utilitarian idea. Well, Bentham, when he died, wanted to overcome superstition and bring scientific thinking to all sorts of human questions. So he was concerned about the mystical feelings people have about death. He insisted that his body be stuffed and put in a glass case in the library of University College London, which he was one of the founders of. That did take place, and his body is still there. There was a webcam on him. And so you can actually go see. It's called the auto icon, and at any point, you can check it out online and just watch Jeremy Bentham there in his glass case. Once here, we had a conference in celebration of the 250th anniversary of his birth, and we gave our papers directly to the auto icon. We had a web link and a big thing in the back of the auditorium that had Jeremy Bentham there, and we gave our talks to Jeremy Bentham. It was one of the creepiest experiences of my life. But anyway, if you look at the fundamental principle that Bentham lays out, it's, I think, worth going through in detail, though I'm going to cheat and actually take Mill's slightly simpler version. Utilitarianism is a view that is a kind of consequentialism, and it takes one principle, known as the principle of utility, for its fundamental principle. Bentham articulates it this way. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. Well, it is worth going through that in detail. But this isn't a class on moral theory, really. If it were, I would go through it all in detail, but we're going to come close to that anyway. Mill puts it more directly. He says, the creed which accepts as the foundations of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that, and here's the principle. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So let's take it in Mill's version. The principle of utility. It looks like this. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. He also gives us the flip side, but let's ignore that for a moment and just focus on that. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. I think that's still grammatical, but now we'd tend to say in proportion to their tendency to promote happiness. But it's the same idea. I want to focus on several things about this to really understand what Mill and Bentham are doing, because it is not what a lot of people think they're doing. And it's very different from what Aristotle is doing, from what Kant is doing. So the first thing to focus on is in proportion. What's going on there? Tell me about what we get out of this. The degree of rightness of an action is proportional to its tendency to promote happiness, right? Yeah. Good, it's a matter of degree, right? And there can be a gray area. This isn't telling us what exactly is right, what exactly is wrong. It is not telling us what we ought to do. It is not telling us what we must not do. It is doing what? It's giving us a proportion. It's really giving us better and worse. It's not really defining right or wrong or ought or should or must not. It's defining better and worse. Things are right in proportions. There are degrees of rightness, degrees of wrongness, okay? So we get this kind of thing, and that's really different. Notice that in Kant, we get something like, okay, could a rational being will that everyone act according to this maxim? The answer is yes or no, right? It's not really a better or worse. He could try to set it up that way. Be interesting to think about a Kantian theory that said, well, I don't know if a rational being would be willing to do this, but I know I'd be more willing to do that than this, right? Then you could have degrees of willingness, and maybe then there could be degrees of rightness in a Kantian theory. And for Aristotle, he talks about things in terms of, here's the mean, here are deviations from the mean. That doesn't involve degrees, but you can see how he could do it. If this is the proper mean, you could say, well, I can be closer to that or further away, so I could make sense of something being more or less virtuous, maybe. Although he doesn't quite set it up that way, he's given you the tools to do it. But here, that's what it does directly, okay? So this is really talking about better and worse, degrees of rightness and wrongness. It's not just drawing a sharp line. Now, second thing I want to focus on is, well, tendency, as they tend to promote happiness. Notice not just as they promote happiness, as they tend to. What's the significance of the tendency here, as opposed to just saying promoting happiness? Yeah?
The consequences are less important, it adds more intent.
Okay, yes, it goes to a greater degree of intent. It has to do with what you expect, right, rather than what actually happens. So you might think, okay, yes, look, we can have an act that tends to produce good, tend to have a bad outcome, but then the ones that actually produce good actually produce bad. So think about that. We've got here, like, tendency promote happiness. I'll just say tendency good. Here, tendency bad. But here, actual result. And we can say, yeah, could be good, could be bad. And we can think, well, okay, all of those are possible, right? There are actions that tend to have good effects, and that do have good, that in this particular case does have a good effect, okay? It's easy to think of examples of that. It's like, yeah, this does something good, and you'd expect that normally that would do something good. For example, I just said it was easy. Come on.
A lot of people who first start working out have a tendency that it sucks, it's awful, this doesn't bring me any happiness whatsoever. As you get to it, your body feels better.
Okay, good. Yeah, so you might think, look, the general tendency of exercise is good, and let's say you do exercise and it has a good effect. So yeah, that would be something that would be good, beneficial in general, beneficial in this particular case. Yeah.
Generally, giving people money is good, but I know there are obviously cases where they might go and spend that money on something that will harm them.
Ooh, okay, good. So yeah, in general, you might say giving money to some people in need. That seems like a beneficial thing. In an actual case, you might help somebody who really needed help. And I've got a friend right now who's undergoing chemotherapy and put out an appeal on Facebook for funds. And I think, helping him would have very good effects. And in general, that kind of thing would have good effects. But you could imagine a case where it has bad effects, where the person gets the money and then does something harmful with it, right? Maybe they use it to take a drug overdose, or so it's bad for them, or maybe it enables them to resume their life of crime, or whatever it is. So yeah, that could be in a sort of case where it works out as you expect. It's like this, but ooh, what about the case where it works out badly? Other examples, yeah.
Oh, no, so just that goes with this, so basically like the homeless, the ones that you see like on the side of the street at the stoplight, the traffic lights. Like you hope that they'll do it to get themselves off the streets, but normally they use it for drugs or alcohol.
Okay, right. So it might be that the tendency is good, but you could imagine somebody using the money you give them for drugs or alcohol or something else harmful, and that would be unfortunate. Yeah.
Giving somebody a ride, but if you may give them a ride, they may turn out to be serial killers.
Yes, okay. Yes, you give somebody a ride, you think ordinarily it's helpful. Hey, this guy needs a ride, I'll give him a ride. But then it turns out he's a serial killer, and so the result of that is very, very bad. Like the Doors song, killer on the road, there's a killer on the road. Heart, what is it, brain squirming like a toad. Anyway, yeah, they had to stretch for that rhyme, but anyway, good song. But yeah, that would be an example of a bad effect. Yeah.
Like a weed seller, like illegally, technically it's bad because that's against the law, but like most people use it just to relax or like for medicinal purposes. So like it has.
Ooh, now, all right, yeah. Yeah, no comment. Actually, let me come back to that in a second. Go ahead.
I feel like what you said about the giving money to the homeless, is it actually the intent or is it just in general? Like you might intend for a homeless person to use the money to better themselves, but
Right.
most people know that they're not going to do that. So does that really count as an action that tends to promote happiness?
Ooh, all right, good. Yes, if we think about an action and then its effects, we think about what comes before the action. And so we think about the intent, the motive, and so on. Kant is going to say, look, these are the things that matter. What really matters, morally speaking, is what takes place before the action. The utilitarian or any other consequentialist is going to say, no, ultimately it depends on the effects. And you could say, well, directly, that is to say, I care about the actually good or bad effects. That is not what Bentham and Mill say. They care about the tendency. But that's not the same, you're absolutely right, as the motive or intent. Because it may be that my intention is good, but I choose a kind of action that actually could be expected to be harmful. And so think of the medieval doctor who bleeds a patient. That doctor is intending to do something good, but the effects of bleeding the patient are typically bad, right? They are in practice bad, let's say, and the tendency of that is bad, right? So the person chooses poorly, to make another movie allusion. And that's something that you could say, well, okay, we can go directly, is the effect itself good or bad? But we can also evaluate this general tendency, this general disposition of that action to have good or bad effects. And that's what they're saying really matters. So we tend to think that's closer to motive or intent, but it's not the same thing. It does enable us to say, look, in this particular case, it worked out badly. But look, in general, it was the right thing to do. So in this sort of case, look, it's not really a problem. These views agree. Here, something that would be bad to do in general, and it's bad in this particular case, easy to imagine that, right? Look, it's bad in general to murder people. In this particular case, that murder, yeah, that was bad. Okay? So easy to come up with those cases. But here are the cases we have to worry about. And we have to think, what do we say about those? So we've seen some examples where, look, in general, the tendency might be good, but in this particular case, it's bad. Maybe help is something that could be like this. In some situations, look, in general, you would expect, now it might be that helping people in certain situations, you can expect it to be bad. But suppose it's the kind of thing where you'd expect it to be good, but in this case, it was unfortunate. Or what are some other cases like that? Generally, this kind of thing is good, but in this particular case, it worked out badly. Yeah.
For the bad and good, when if you get sick and you get the flu and you go to the doctor and they find that you have like a tumor or something like that, that's something that was bad that became good because you caught it early.
Ooh, all right, good. Yes, here you think, wait a minute, my getting the flu is bad. But then it turns out that's what enables the doctor to find this other more serious thing and cure you of that. Like, ooh, that's good. So yes, you might say the mild illness, right, might have turned out to be, look, in general, it's bad to get even a mild illness, but in that case, maybe it turned out to be good. Yeah.
So like good and bad, like doctors prescribing pain medication whenever you're recovering from surgery, you hope that will help them in recovery, not that they would get addicted to it later on.
Good. So yes, the pain medication. Look, in general, it's a good thing to have the pain medication. However, sorry, yeah, other way. Never mind, thank you. But in a particular case, somebody might get addicted to it. When I had my wisdom teeth out, my wife did it just before me. Hers was easy. She didn't even take any of her pain medication. Mine was awful. Last thing I remember as they were putting the mask over me is the one doctor saying to the other, whoa, looking at the x-ray, whoa, it doesn't get any worse than this. Like, wait. And so I took all my pain medication, all of her pain medication. And I was very grateful to have all that, but on the other hand, I didn't get addicted, that's fine. My dissertation director, however, a very famous American philosopher, did get addicted to pain medication. He had back surgery and in a similar kind of thing was on pain, and he became an addict and was addicted to it for about 10 years. So that kind of thing can be very serious and a bad effect. Other things that you might expect in general to be bad but turn out good in a particular case. Yeah? Lying. Okay, good. You might think in general it's bad to tell lies, but in a particular case, maybe lying was the right thing to do. Right? It turned out, I shouldn't put it that way. That's begging the question. I want to say, it turned out well that you told the lie in this particular case. Yeah.
I think on the other side too, like telling the truth, sometimes when you know it's going to be bad for you, it ends up being good.
Yes, okay, good. Sometimes you tell the truth in a circumstance where you think,
Okay.
Yeah.
We
Go
snuck
ahead.
into a party one time.
okay,
Like, I should have this coming up. So, we snuck into an event and we were going to get kicked out, but we ended up just telling the truth. We were kind of wasted. And we got just ended up telling the truth. And
Okay.
the guy, it was like, we were like already to get kicked out. And the guy was like, thanks for telling me the truth. And we ended up just staying there as a result of it and it ended up being kind of good. It's not
Oh.
a extent, but like,
Fair.
that happened.
Yeah, very nice. Often, confessing is bad, but sometimes it works out well. One of the things that seemed to me I learned in elementary school was never confess, right? Yeah. Does anybody know who put that tack in his seat? Never say, okay? And it's not just don't rat out other people. It's like if you did it, you might think, oh, it'll be okay because I told the truth. No, it's never okay. It's always better lie. But not always, right? On occasion, telling the truth, even when you might expect it to be bad in that context, turns out okay. Yeah.
I've actually never had a greater sense of unity than when we were all in trouble while I was in training for the military. Like, we could all hate each other, like, to the extreme, but, like, as soon as someone got in trouble, like, no one snitched in public.
Oh, all right, in-group loyalty right there, yeah, right? Yeah, that can be very, very powerful. And so sometimes, I mean, I don't think teachers are trying to do this in elementary school, but it does produce a certain cohesion among the class, right? You might hate each other, and that's why you were putting that tack in this other kid's seat. But as soon as the teacher turns and demands a confession, it's kind of like, we're all in this together, aren't we, guys? And it becomes a different thing. And the same thing in the military, the same thing on a sports team, maybe, you know? You're all there yelling at each other. Man, you screwed up. You were the one who lost us that game. But then either the coach is mean to you all or some reporter writes something negative about the team, and suddenly you're all like, that lousy reporter or that lousy coach, and you're all in it together. And so you can sometimes use that sort of external enemy to actually unite a group that otherwise doesn't seem very united. Okay, well, now in these kinds of cases, the question is, well, what do we say about that? Is what we focus on the actual result, or is what we focus on the tendency? So for example, here, do we say, well, actually your example too is sometimes telling the truth is like this. So to what degree was that right? Telling the lie that turned out to be the right thing to do in that situation. Do we say, so lying was the right thing to do? Or do we say, well, still you got lucky, man. The tendency was bad, so it was the wrong thing to do. You just lucked out. You have a real decision to make. And what Bentham and Mill say is, the right thing to say is, you did the wrong thing. You just got lucky, okay? But you could imagine saying, no, you did the right thing. Here's a kind of painful case. Well, actually, I suppose we can do it with the pain medication. The doctor prescribes the pain medication. Turns out the patient becomes addicted. What do we say about the rightness of the doctor's action? Did the doctor do the right thing or not? Or the doctor vaccinates the child, but it's the one child in a million that has a negative reaction to the vaccine, and let's say the child ends up dying. Did the doctor do the right thing in vaccinating the child? Now, if you say yes, you're basically all on board with Bentham and Mill. You say, look, you did the right thing. That was the thing that was expected to have a good result. You got unlucky. That was the one child that had the negative reaction. Or that was a patient who got addicted. But you didn't do anything wrong, doctor. You assigned the right medication at the right time in the right amount. It's just that bad luck, okay? And that's where they come down on this. A different kind of consequentialist would say, I care about the actual consequences. And so actually, I am going to say, it turned out in this case you did the wrong thing. I mean, in general, that's the right thing to do, but in this case, giving that child the vaccine or giving that patient the pain medication, that was the wrong thing to do. And I think there's that clicks too at some level. Yeah.
Could you argue that kind of tendency is different for different situations, like the vaccinating the child through a doctor, like you're talking about the right reason, the right time, like that's very Aristotelian.
Right.
But there's also other things where it's like you have like good intentions, like say you start this new economic program and it's like, okay, cool, you have these great intentions, but it ends up being a failure. Is that the same? Or it's like often there are like bad intentions in like creating like new programs and then they end up being like really good.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, intention is something Kant focuses on. Neither Bentham nor Mill think the intention is really part of it. In fact, Mill at one point says, look, I don't care about your intentions. You might save the drowning person because you think it's your duty. You might save the drowning person because you hope he'll be grateful and pay you money for doing it. I don't care, you're doing the right thing because you're doing something that could reasonably be expected to have a good result. It's the expected character of the action that matters, the tendency of the action itself. That's not a matter of intent. So if we think about social policies, what matters is that the kind of thing that typically works out well. It's true, sometimes people with the best of intentions institute terrible policies. Sometimes with actually self-interested, nasty motives, they institute good policies. But the utilitarian says, well, I don't care about their intentions. I care about the policy results. But I recognize that sometimes a good policy is actually going to cause trouble in that particular combination of circumstances. You just got unlucky. And the same thing here, and that can happen with What would be a case of that? Somebody does what is a reasonable thing to do. That's a policy that in general works out very well. But in those particular circumstances, it turns out to work out badly. Yeah.
A lot of people agree that the tough on drugs and tough on crime acts from like the early 2000s and 90s were a good intention and like good tendency, like more strict crime control and more strict like drug regulation, but in turn it caused like an entire generation of lost fathers that went to jail and like never got out of like inner city communities and stuff like that.
Okay, so that could be a case where we say, well, the intention was good, and actually the general kind of thing of getting serious about crime and so forth, that's a good thing. But in these particular circumstances, with certain communities that were very vulnerable, it actually turned out to be a bad thing, right, for those communities. And so was it the right thing to do? Well, to some extent, the answer that Bentham and Mill give would be it was the right thing. It's not a moral failing. It might be that there was bad luck here and certain kinds of effects in certain kinds of contexts that weren't expected. And so we don't fault the person, whatever their intent, but we fault them if we think, look, in general, that was the kind of thing you'd expect to be bad. So if you should have reasonably expected that, we blame you. But if it's the kind of effect that you couldn't reasonably be expected to anticipate, we don't blame you. Okay, that's a question of moral luck, and that's different. Yeah.
So by like tendency, we're just talking about like foreseeability, right?
Something like foreseeability, which is part of the reason in Bentham's version, he talks about the tendency the thing appears to have. That adds another dimension, the actual tendency as opposed to the apparent tendency. But I think what Bentham has in mind is, I'm giving you a rule for decision. You might say, I'm not sure what the tendency of this kind of policy is. Is it in general going to tend to have good effects or bad effects? He says, well, what is it? What do you think, right? You've got to go with the appearance. If you believe that was the right thing to do. So, for example, look at those medieval doctors who bled patients. Were they doing the right thing? Mill would say, no, the tendency of that action is bad. But the tendency it appeared to them to have, well, that was good. They thought it had a good tendency. So do we morally blame them? Bentham would say, no, we don't morally blame them. We blame them for getting the science wrong, for being confused about the medicine. They were bad doctors, but that doesn't mean they were bad people, right? They weren't choosing the wrong action, morally speaking, he would say, even if medically speaking they were. Mill doesn't have much patience with that distinction. He would just sort of say, look, the tendency was bad. They were doing the wrong thing. And whether it's medically the wrong thing or morally the wrong thing, Mill doesn't really care about that distinction. He wants, and Bentham wants too, to tell you how to make decisions. Now, I want to come back to this question about proportions, because you might say, well, okay, good. You've been telling me about the degrees of rightness and wrongness. You've been telling me what's better than what, but I want to know what I have to do. After all, one of the things that morality does is draw boundaries around us. Are there things I must not do? After all, think about the 10 Commandments. They're not saying, murder, there are probably better ways of solving your problems. They're saying, thou shalt not murder, right? And so you might think, are there any thou shalt nots in the neighborhood here? How do we know when there's something we must not do? Or is it just all better and worse? It's like, well, murder is kind of on the worst side. Is there a way of talking about ought or should or must here? Yeah.
Well, isn't there like an issue of like how broad or specific we can be with an action? Like, for example, like telling the truth might have the tendency to be bad, but how do we or tendency to be good? Like, is there like a context to the truth and that's what we're like not going to do, or is it like the truth in general?
Oh, okay, good question. What kind of tendency are we talking about here? Just as Kant has this problem about maxims, what is the maxim of my action? Is it to do this, tell a lie, for example? Or is it to tell a lie to a murderer at the door? Or to tell a lie to a murderer at the door on Wednesday? What's the degree of specificity? You might say the same thing here. If I'm dealing with tendencies, I'm dealing with kinds of action. But look, this kind of action might be described as a lie, or a lie to a murderer, or a lie in order to save a life, or a lie on a Wednesday, what is the proper kind, right, that goes along with this action? And so you might think there's exactly a parallel problem as soon as we think about tendencies. What is the tendency of this kind of action, we have to ask. Now I have to be able to identify this kind of action. And it's tricky for exactly the same reasons that Kant runs into that trouble. Yeah?
I think you have to kind of imagine it on a scale when it comes to proportion for it. Like telling a lie to children that Santa Claus is real may weigh certain points on the scale, and then being a pathological liar may outweigh everything like that to where you shouldn't do that at all. It just took the scale so completely.
Okay. Right, good. Lying is surely too broad here, right? Because if I'm thinking, may I tell this lie in this situation? I don't want to say, so is lying in general, presumably lying in general is a bad thing. And so is down here somewhere on this scale. But if I think, wait a minute, I'm telling a lie in this kind of situation, right? And I've got to specify it fairly precisely. Now, I'm not going to specify it so precisely that I say to Joe Smith on Wednesday, etc. But something has to be done to make it specific. Yeah, David.
Yeah, along the lines of Santa, here's an example of good intention, bad effect, which is very relevant. And that's when I was a kid, I finally figured out that Santa didn't exist in about third grade, somewhere around there. And I thought, these kids have been lied to their whole lives. I have to go spread the truth. And so I went around telling all these kids, no, my parents told me Santa does not exist. You're being lied to. All my friends. And next thing you know, my parents were inundated with phone calls. And I was in trouble. But I thought I was doing the right thing.
I appreciate your confession. We now all think less of you. Yes. Look, that kind of thing is sometimes a serious problem, right? You think you are standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. And it turns out that actually it was really a good thing that certain people didn't know the truth. And so it's not something that just applies in this kind of situation to children, though you're right, that's an excellent example. You can imagine all sorts of situations where actually it's pretty dangerous to go around telling the truth. What's another more adult type of situation where you might say you find out the truth, but it's actually really a dangerous thing to start telling everybody that, and it's going to have negative effects? Yeah, maybe the 23andMe type example. You find out something like, you're not my father, and you're not my brother, and so on. Maybe telling them that is not really something that will have good effects. Yeah.
Like you find out that like everyone's gonna lose their job, and so like whenever a company's shutting down, but they don't say that just because they know people are gonna leave in advance, and then that way it just kind of speeds up the process.
Okay, excellent example. You find out the company is preparing to file for Chapter 11 or something. And you think, whoa, okay, they're keeping this a secret now. And for good reason, right? Should you go around and tell everybody, oh, the company's going to file for bankruptcy. Get out now. That may be exactly the wrong thing to do. Not just because it will make people unhappy, but because it will sink the company much sooner. It will make it much harder for them to try to recover from this, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Not sure if it would be harmful to other people, but like in the case of insider trading, that could have a bad effect on you, even though you're trying to like let others know and give them, what you think is good advice.
Okay, good. You work for some company and you find out something major, a merger is about to take place, or there's been an offer made, but so far it's a secret. And you think, well, everybody needs to know this, right? So you first tell all your relatives, and then you call up the Wall Street Journal and say, hey, guess what I've heard? That could be a very bad thing, and you could end up in jail. So yeah, in organizational context, actually this comes up all the time, because you're in a position where okay, you have this knowledge, but it's very important that you, for legal reasons, for moral reasons, for just reasons of prudence in the company, keep that a secret, right? And it's much broader, of course. There are all sorts of situations where you need to keep a secret, even if that means you really have to mislead or even lie to people to maintain the secrecy. Yeah.
I think the concept of tendency is even broader
Okay, excellent, yes. Part of the reason that both Bentham and Mill do this is they're interested in policy questions. And so there is the question of whether this thing in this situation is the right thing to do. But they want something that will be a rule for politics as well as for morality. And so not only give us rules we can go by in thinking about what we ought to do individually, but in setting policy. And that means, look, you can't set a different policy for everything. Like, are you free to speak? Well, depends. What are you going to say to whom? And we have to see how it actually affects them and whether the effects of this speech are good or bad. That's hopeless, right? We have to set a policy. And so Mill argues on liberty in favor of the liberty of thought and discussion, largely on these entirely on these utilitarian grounds. But it's crucial that we be deciding on the basis of kinds of action, because he admits that there are certain kinds of speech, for one thing, that are in general bad and have a harmful tendency. So he says, can you criticize corn merchants in the newspaper? Sure. Can you shout down with corn merchants in front of the house of a corn merchant when there's a mob with torches there that are, that would love to haul him out of the house and kill him? No, that's inciting to riot. So there are general exceptions like that. But beyond those general exceptions, he says, you cannot do it. That's not to deny that that speech in that situation might be harmful. But the fact is we have to judge on the basis of tendencies of actions when we think about the law. And so Bentham and Mill are willing to say this is a rule for legislation as well as for private morality because they deal with tendencies. And of course, the politician or the legislator has to deal in tendencies and kinds of action. Yeah.
But if we're ever going to make a prescriptive statement, don't we have to do it in a circumstance of comparisons? Like, how do you make any ought statements ever without comparing to the circumstances you're in?
Well,
Options that you have.
good. How do you actually formulate one of these without any reference to the circumstances? You do have to appeal to circumstances, but to kinds of circumstances. So speech is a great example. What Mill says, do you pay attention to? Well, is there immediate danger to the people around you? That's why inciting to riot is something you could prohibit. But on the other hand, saying that in a newspaper editorial, people should be free to do that. There's no immediate riot or incitement taking place there. What about the time or manner of speaking? May I write that down in an editorial for the Daily Texan or the Washington Post? Of course. May I broadcast it in a loudspeaker in your neighborhood at 3 a.m.? No. Okay, so I can control that kind of thing, and I can control even the content of your speech if it's in a circumstance where it's likely to provoke harm. But of course, we've got to think about the dangers of that. There are a couple of Supreme Court decisions where that kind of clear and present danger has been appealed to. And it's controversial what the boundaries of that are. The famous example from Oliver Wendell Holmes is shouting fire in a crowded theater. But of course, if there really is a fire, maybe you should shout fire in the crowded theater. So, and how crowded should it be and so on. The boundaries of this can be difficult to determine. And there was in the case Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942, the fighting words doctrine. Can you say something that a reasonable person would regard as fighting words and therefore prompt violence? Isn't that like the inciting to riot thing? I very much doubt that that would be upheld in court now. If it were, almost every editorial produced since Donald Trump's election would probably violate it. But partly, you've got to appreciate the joke there, you really have to know what Chaplinsky said that got him in trouble with the state of New Hampshire. He called somebody a goddamn fascist, okay? And that was thought to be fighting words, and he could be jailed for calling somebody a goddamn fascist. Today, I'm quite sure you could get away with calling someone a fascist. I've done it myself to a dean. Probably wasn't my wisest career move. Anyway, yeah.
I think it's important that they have like quantifying features of like proportion and ten, like in today, especially with like speech and stuff like that. So you had like in science, you would quantify everything to the fact that like some speech is hate speech, so we can't allow that sometimes. Like on Facebook, they have algorithms that now detect if something is hate speech or if it's like something that will influence people in a certain way, and now they take that stuff down. You know, so same way. I think.
Well, right. And so one of the dangers here is that once you say, well, this could cause negative effects, you can think, oh man, now, where do I draw the boundaries? This could get very, very sweeping and very, very broad.
Sounds pretty goddamn fascist.
So it sounds pretty goddamn fascist, yeah. So that's why, from Mill's point of view, it would be like, no, there has to be immediate danger to immediately present people. So inciting a riot in front of the person's house, that's one thing. But to publish the words "down with corn merchants," where you think, hey, but somebody might read them and decide they're going to riot in front of a corn merchant's house and go get it. Like, no, that's a possibility. A possibility is not a tendency. When you criticize someone, does that tend to promote violence? No, that's not the typical outcome, right? Although to say something in front of a violent mob that's sort of already really angry, maybe that is the kind of thing that has this tendency. So there's a difference, he would say, between a tendency and a possibility. What is happening now with a lot of these algorithms is, oh, there's a possibility that someone might blah, blah, blah. Mill says, I don't care. Yeah, of course, there's always such a possibility. There's a possibility that you will mention the name Immanuel Kant, and somebody will say, oh, I remember him from my college course. God, I hated that. In fact, I'm so filled with hatred. I'm going to go kill the next person I find. Okay? That could happen. But you can't let that possibility control things. You've got to think, is it probable that? Right? And, okay, he thinks if you're in a situation where it is probable that that speech is going to lead to a harmful effect, then you can restrict it. But not in this broader way. You've really got to think the tendency of that action is, the probability, in other words, is not just noticeable, but overwhelming that that will be the effect, that it will have a negative effect to justify the restriction. And so, insofar as speech is thought to, stem from hate, Mill says, I don't care. That's a question of intent. I'm not judging intent. If somebody tells the truth, for example, I don't care whether they are intending to do harm with it or intending to do something good with it. And similarly, if they say something, well, if they like saving the drowning person, if someone says something that is harmful, like it could be expected to have a bad effect, I don't care why they're doing it. I just care what is the tendency of the action. So maybe the person says down with corn merchants not because they want violence, maybe because they are trying to, redirect the crowd. They're like, yeah, this is the owner of the company, but I'm talking about the merchants. I'm talking about the guys down on the docks. They're the crooks. So I say down with corn merchants, and I mean these guys up there. But they misinterpreted me. I don't care what your intent is. The question is, what's the tendency of the kind of action? And it's got to be a question of probabilities.